Away from the Western Togoland secession issue, a survey by the Ghana Statistical Service has revealed that most localities in Ghana have not benefited from government's free water. Government announced free water and electricity as part of measures to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on the citizenry. Key amongst its findings is that close to 78% of localities did not benefit from the subsidy on water. Well, let me just bring you more on that survey. We would also be joined by Head of Price Statistics at the Statistical Service, John Foster Ajahu. But here's more of the findings of that survey. Key amongst those findings is that there was a rise in crime. 34.1% of localities saw an increase in crime. Lockdown localities saw the highest, 47.1%, quite surprising. Increasing in crimes, theft and burglary were the two most common crimes, followed by domestic violence and assaults in that order. There is also the limited reach of subsidies on utilities, and this is quite the focus for us because at the time this was announced, there was a variety of reactions. While some lauded it, some spoke about the lack of access to water, and so they were not even going to benefit from this in the first place. So close to 25% and 78% of localities did not benefit from the subsidies on electricity. I'll be showing you more on that because there are more graphics, pictures that tell the story in a better way. But we've been joined by John Foster Ajahu, who is Head of Price Statistics at the Statistical Service. Thank you so much for joining the program, sir.
Thank you for having me.
All right, great. So quickly, let's just find out, why was this survey necessary in the first place?
So the motivation for conducting this study was to help contribute to the state effort in trying to, if you like, assist people that will be heavily hit by the pandemic. And we were of the opinion that if we do not provide data that will inform policy, then the pandemic may end up, deepening the inequality that we have in our country. And so this motivated us to provide some data so that indeed we could bring the issue of the vulnerable communities to the attention of policymakers so that they can be assisted appropriately.
Interesting. So you coordinated this project, and the issue of free water and electricity was exciting for a lot of people, but there were also concerns about the lack of access to it in the first place, and so those who already had access were going to be the beneficiaries. Government came up with a different plan for unreached or underserved communities, and that was to use the tanker services. In your research, did you identify at any point if some of these localities actually benefited from the tanker services?
Yes, indeed. I mean, quite a number of localities benefited. But then what the finding is bringing out the fact that, yes, even though there was this alternative arrangement for localities to be served with these tanker services, laudable as it is though, but then it was not enough to reach all localities. And don't forget the issue about the subsidy basically was more for communities that were being served by the Ghana Water Company. And so other localities that were using alternative source of drinking water, then invariably were going to benefit from that subsidy. And quite a number of them did not get, these tanker services. Yes, it was, we saw more, especially in the lockdown areas, like the Greater Accra metropolitan area and the Greater Kumasi and the surroundings. But then going further into the district, the hinterlands, this was quite on a limited scale.
Tell us more about the communities you surveyed. What is their demographic, the make of these communities? High-end communities or local, rural? Just help us understand.
So we took, a very representative sample of all communities in the country. And so you really have, AMA, we first selected from the district and then the localities. So it cut across all the demographics, the rich, the poor, as we may call them. So we have Kumasi, we have Accra, and then we have the rural ones in there. And then it is striking to see that, yes, whilst the Greater Accra Metropolis and Kumasi and other areas are getting some of these services, then those who are far apart, the vulnerable ones, unfortunately did not get. That is what this survey is bringing to attention of all of us to address.
There was also something very interesting in one of your findings about border districts being the hardest hit. I'll be showing something shortly where you focus on the cost, for example, of products. And in hand sanitizer, in the case of hand sanitizers, for example, the border communities were so high in the graphic display or description of that information. Did we find out why this was so?
Yes, we had it was a community kind of interview, a focus group interview, and interestingly, the border districts, have quite a substantial of their activities depending on trans-border trade, and so you are aware. All of us are aware that because of the pandemic, the borders have to be closed. In fact, and they still remain closed. So it therefore then suggests that majority of them who depended on the trans-border trade could not then, carry on the activities. And so then you have more people now chasing fewer goods, and the law of demand and supply will tell you, definitely, of course, then prices will go up. And so, in fact, for me, the interesting thing for us all is that then we should begin to realize that there's a need for us to create alternative source of livelihood for these people. So even if the borders still remain closed, how can we get these products from other areas to them so that the prices can be brought to reachable levels?
Okay, so we also have masks, which were quite high, some about 40%, 38.2% of people in border districts said they were not able to buy them. And there was also the issue about food items and how during the period they went very high. And I want to believe that is because people were buying in excess and keeping at home in fear of food shortage, right?
Well, that could be partly true. It's also the case that, as I said, because they were not having the access, the supply was cut short. And so the few that was there, then the people took an undue advantage and they were exploiting the consumers. In fact, even in areas that did not record that high, as we saw in Accra and other areas, people took advantage of the pandemic and they were increasing prices arbitrarily. So you can imagine those who were even far away from the capital city. So the few sellers that will tell you, we went to Accra, they've increased the price, transport has gone up, and then they slapped so much, margins on that. And so yes, life for the rural, what I call rural districts, in terms of prices of goods was really, really, really unbearable during the pandemic, the heat of the pandemic.
Mr. Ajaho, there was also the issue of crime. And I remember when this came up, I saw the reaction of some of the people I shared the information with, and they were a bit surprised. The thinking was that during the lockdown period, because a lot of people were at home and there were very few people outside, crime would have reduced because there's less movement. And so if anybody was going to move, the police would check them. If you were coming out, there was going to be some enforcement asking you to go back home. What did you find as the reason for the increase in crime? I'll come back to the domestic violence bit because that's on a different scale, but let's talk about burglary and theft.
So on the crime, you are talking about the issue of the police. It then begs the question whether we have indeed enough policemen and women to be able to police all our localities at all times. And again, the issue about we being at home, that is true, but then why the theft case? Remember, most people who have lost their job because of the pandemic, people are not getting income or not getting food to eat, will find ways to survive. And so, for example, if you were home and they know you were always home, they'll be monitoring you. The slightest inch that you may step out or probably sleep at night, they take advantage. So yes, we were home, but the criminals were developing strategies to also survive, so to speak. Illegal though. So yes, police were there, but they were not almost at all the places, because of the numbers. And indeed, as you say, if you are going out, the barriers are there, they send you back. But the theft case was not being conducted at the barriers there. It was being carried out in the homes, in the rural communities, where, police presence might not be there. Yeah.
Sadly, there was also an increase in domestic abuse and domestic violence. In the cases and with the victims that you spoke to, how were these acts carried out? And is it the case that these people were already victims of abuse, and so having them in a lockdown situation aggravated their case, or these are fresh abuse cases? These are families where there were no issues of domestic violence, but because of the lockdown and maybe the stress associated with this?
Precisely. I mean, this study covered the period of the pandemic and especially the lockdown. And so all the reported cases of crime happened within the lockdown period at that time. So these were fresh issues. Unfortunately, we did not speak to the victims themselves. Okay. But of course, I mean, as in our earlier discussion, we're talking about the fact that now people are home more. Then, of course, you could, I mean, it is expected. It's not a good thing, but you wouldn't be too surprised that because people are more at home, then they begin to, if you like, exhibit that bad character of theirs. And so it behoves on all of us to begin to do more education. I mean, people are doing a lot. So that we have to really have an orientation, character change. And the fact that you are staying home with your children and your wife doesn't mean that any slightest provocation you have to abuse them. No.
All right. Mr. Jaho, finally, is this the last of this COVID-19 impact survey we are going to see?
No, not at all. So we are still having discussion with our partners, because as you say, this is generating a lot of interest and discussion around it, and that's what we seek to do, to bring the data so that policymakers would get, for example, the issue about water. Then if we are admitting that something else happened, then we know what policies they can use for targeting the vulnerable. So yes, there'll be more that will come. And indeed, even for this wave, there are a lot of findings that we're going to be sharing as we go ahead. There's issue about death. We're going to come along with that, so we know whether indeed there are more deaths that are not being reported or whatever. So there are a lot that we're going to continue doing, and there'll be more waves. That
will be interesting, especially on the death bit. Thank you very much for your time. This head of price statistics, Mr. Foster Ajaho. He's with the Ghana Statistical Service, and we've been talking about their recent survey on the impact of COVID-19, and we've been finding out that about 78% of localities in the country didn't benefit from government's free water and other amenities well.